all, this is your Professor Ian again. Time for part 2 of my Intro to Argumentation lecture. So let's move on. We were talking about some basics, talking about Monty Python skit. Let's move on to the Rebecca Jones article that you're reading. You're going to go through it in depth, but I just want to give you some of the highlights. Some of the things that she points out is that, our society, again, too often defines argument as a battle or a war, right? Like I was saying, argument doesn't have to be oppositional. And Rebecca Jones explores this point very well in her essay. It doesn't have to be losers and winners in an argument per se. Arguments can be a productive activity. She notes that people, quote, agree on the primary standpoint and are willing to concede a point of view if proven wrong, end point. So you can see how that relates to Michael Pallin's idea that an argument is a series of propositions leading to a conclusion, right? An argument can be a way to find truth or to find some kind of solution to a problem. However, public arguments are rarely set up that way in our society. And I'll let you go through this. I've loaded this up. It's just a funny example of a collection of clips from different news programs where they just put people battling head to head. Very unproductive, but it makes for good TV. It's very entertaining. I'll let you look at that yourself. But let's move on. In order to have productive arguments, we need to think beyond this kind of entrenched model of oppositional battles as argument that we have in our society, this kind of either or setup that we're used to having in our society, on TV especially. And so to help us think about that, what we work on in this course, what we'll be doing is breaking down arguments and seeing how they're structured, seeing what kind of rhetorical techniques that authors are using, right, in order to persuade an audience. Because the more you know about this kind of stuff, the more you can detect it and decode arguments instead of being sucked into points of view or into battles because of different techniques that authors are using to try to manipulate, persuade, and influence you. Okay, so I like to think of what we're working on this course as a kind of critical thinking toolbox. We'll be adding tools to this critical thinking toolbox as we go through the semester, specific terms, specific ideas, things like that. And our first set of tools to add to our critical thinking toolbox is the classical appeals, or are the classical appeals. You might have come across these before: pathos, ethos, and logos. These are concepts that are, as old as human argumentation is. These are not something invented by Aristotle, but they were written about by Aristotle, and he kind of gave us the terms that we use to talk about these things, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. So we often think about the classical appeals as tied to Aristotle in this specific way. Okay? That's why we call them the classical appeals too, because they go back to classic Greece in the Athenian period in the 4th century of Athens in ancient Greece. Okay, so Aristotle talked about ethos, pathos, and logos, right? You might have heard these before. Pathos is emotions. Go back there. And you can remember this because pathos looks like the word pathetic, and pathetic just means playing on emotions. It tends to have a negative connotation, pathetic, but it doesn't have to. It just means playing on emotions. So pathetic. Ethos, right, has to do with ethics or credibility. Mostly credibility as we use it, but it looks like the word ethics. So you can see it has to do with like a sense of right or wrong, and from there you can remember it also has to do with credibility, tied to specific credible sources. And then logos looks like the word logic, and that's what it has to do with, logical arguments. Okay, so none of these terms are good or bad necessarily. Like, we tend to think of pathos as a negative thing, like using emotions to win an argument is a terrible thing. But research is finding that almost every argument is at least in part decided by emotions. Nobody wins an argument through pure logic unless you're in a debate club or something like that. In the real world, emotions are part of every decision that we make. And emotions are definitely tied to ethos, right? My feelings for a celebrity or a credible source are definitely tie into how credible I find someone, right? So logos we tend to think of as, the best appeal in our society, or the way you should argue and you should form arguments, you should use logic. But pathos and ethos are not necessarily bad, right? And they're all tied together. Okay, so let's take a closer look at some of these. Pathos, again, this is an appeal meant to elicit an emotional response. And again, it doesn't have to be a negative emotional response. We use pathos to talk about if I want to elicit a joyful response, right? If I want to make you happy or I want to make you grateful or something like that, any kind of like positive emotion as well as using humor, right? If I'm using humor to get an emotional laugh response from somebody, we can describe that as an appeal to pathos. Pathos is important because it allows us to appeal to emotions to create bonds, right? To create an emotional bond with our listener. We often use what they call anchors to establish that the reader and the author share like a mutual understanding about the world. So I might appeal to your love of children or something like that, right? As I note here, values, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors. It covers a wide range. Anchors can be, anything. I could say, my anchor could be that we're both young people or that we're both liberals or conservatives, right? Any of these kind of anchors that's going to help build this emotional bridge is an important part of this pathos. Okay, so what I want you to do, I'm going to end my video here. I want you to watch this next video, which I've linked on Canvas. Take a look at that and then pick up number 3 of the video. Thank you very much.